Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh, and welcome to the series, The Cross Questioned. Inshallah, we are going to be looking at how we can see from the pages of the Bible that the crucifixion is in fact something that cannot be relied upon in the text itself. But we're on our way to proving that. It's going to take a long time to get there because we have to do this thoroughly. But inshallah, we've been looking at other interesting things along the way. For example, we have been looking at how the books came to be put together that we now find in the pages of the Bible, how they voted on the books, how the books were put under a table similar to this. They locked the room, and somehow, miraculously, the books that were supposed to be in the New Testament miraculously floated up to the top of the table. Anyone found with any other text other than those ones on top of the table would be put to death if caught with those books. We also spoke about how Paul came on the scene into Christianity and how he overthrew all the teachings of the Christians that were around during the time of the Prophet Isa, peace be upon him, and took away their authority and replaced it with his own. We also looked at the Gospels as we have them today were extremely unreliable, and any of the books that we find in the New Testament are also unreliable, because specifically the Gospels, because these books were written about 100 years, and I said conservatively we'll give it to those people who have been arguing and saying no, it was 30 years. Even if they were written 30 years after the fact, it would be very, very difficult for these books to be accurate. Thus, they are based on hearsay from a long lost past. No human has ever lived that has been able to recall perfectly the past events with such a long period of time going by without affecting the actual content of what happened or being affected by what has happened in the meantime. Imagine, for example, if you're a supporter of cricket and Australia played a game of cricket and one of the people in the match was caught for rigging the game. In other words, he'd been involved in gambling or something. Even when you talk about Australia 20 years later in the future, if you're an Australian fan, you're going to try to ignore that event and make sure that you never bring it up. But if you're from India or South Africa or whatever country is playing them, you're going to say, and we're going to be playing Australia today, the country that was caught with being involved in whatever scandal it was. Because you've been influenced by the events that have taken place in that period of time. So it is very, very, very difficult. There is no human that has ever lived that has been able to not be influenced by what happened in the time between from when it happened to when he records it. Even the history of your own government. Think of your own countries, your own government. You'll be able to say, yeah, that actually happened. I remember that happening in my country. Because we are not able to do that. We just aren't that not polluted. You see, the oral evidence that we have or will always be polluted by great distances of time. The longer the time period, the more likelihood that that information will be polluted. And this is why we find that many people in the world, especially evangelists, will try not to tell you about the period of time that it took for a book to be written. Because they know that your logical brain will say, this has probably been polluted. There is no reason why the evangelist should be expected to escape this natural tendency of doing exactly the same thing, because we would do it. There are two factors made very clear while there is a vulnerability in the fact that information passed from such a long period of time will be polluted. And this actually this is what I'm going to be quoting is from a person in South Africa who gave these two reasons. And he said that there are two factors made that are particularly important why people will have information over a long, especially oral evidence over a long period of time being polluted. And he's a South African, his name is Jacques Verster. And he said, first, the very nature, the mere fact, the main reason that because the language is mostly of an oral nature, it wasn't written down, there is a vulnerability of the information that is being brought to be influenced by contemporary color. In other words, like we said in the beginning, whatever's happening around you, because it's of an oral nature, because it's a verbal transfer, it's not been written down, it's not been recorded on tape, nobody had a video camera to video it at that time or take a snapshot, there is a great chance that the source will be influenced by its surrounding. And then he also says, secondly, that because of the extraordinary rapid, radical development which transformed this infant church during the decades that it started, that it separated the actual gospel, what was really being said, from what Jesus, peace be upon him, was saying, and from what the early church was doing. So this made it very difficult for the writers to understand how things had been done before these changes occurred. Because it developed so quickly, it became very difficult for them to understand what was going on in all different parts of the religious community at the time. If you see a book is transferred at a very slow rate, it's more easy to find out, did this really happen, to cross-question, to ask people, to double-check. This is what happened with a number of the hadith, is that they'd be double-checked, they'd be checked for credentials, they'd want to have a lineage for it. Who did the narration? What is the chain? There's none of this when we look into Christianity. There is no chain that we can say, this bloodline can be checked, or this person's credentials can be checked. There's nobody. It's by a person, whoever it might be. There is no chain that we can follow. And this is why Islam is very different. When a narration is made, we can follow the line. This person heard from that person, who gave it to that person, who lived in this village, who was a cousin of that person, who was the sister of this person. A very easy chain to be able to be investigated, not only in this time, but in that time. But we find that doesn't exist. So this is one of the second reasons that this brother gives. So if we look and we find that something as simple as the Lord's Prayer, you know, we all have heard, many of us went to, even if you're a Muslim and you lived in a Christian country, perhaps you haven't even lived in a Christian country, there's two things you know well: the Lord's Prayer and footprints in the sand. Those are the two things you'll know about Christianity. There's those posters that have the person's footprints walking into the ocean, and you see only one set of footprints, and the poem that's written there, which also has nothing to do with Christianity, but it's one of the most famous things. And the second most famous thing is the Lord's Prayer. And the Lord's Prayer is something that I've always found quite amusing, because if we really read the text, he doesn't say, pray this prayer. He says, pray along these lines. In other words, each line in the Lord's Prayer is actually a separate prayer. It's not one completed prayer, but that's going off the topic for today's point. But let us consider just one example, and that is the Lord's Prayer, and looking at how we can see a breakdown in communication from one generation to the other, and understanding of the interpretation, or even how it can be polluted by the two ways that that brother in South Africa, Jacques Besset, had given us an example, where he said, one, it can be polluted because of inaccuracy and growing too fast, and the second is because of being influenced by the color of the surrounding around you. In other words, the culture, the influences, the stories, the rumors. So let's look at it from the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is the only teaching of Jesus wherein he instructs his disciples how to pray. He doesn't tell them anywhere else how to pray. So it's the only instruction in the entire Christendom where your God, supposedly, or in at least the prophet of Christianity, is teaching his disciples how to pray. I mean, we as Muslims, when we hear how to pray from the prophet's mouth, we want to know exactly how he did it. I mean, how did he stand? What did he do? What did he do before? We are so inquisitive because this is the prophet you're talking about. Yet, in Christianity, it's the only teaching of Jesus wherein he instructs his disciples how to pray. So, it is going to be perfect, because no one can possibly get this wrong. I mean, this is the only time, one and only time. So Mark and John, who are close followers, supposedly of the prophet Isa, peace be upon him, must surely mention the Lord's Prayer. But neither John or Mark even mention the Lord's Prayer. It's not even in existence. It doesn't even appear. The only two people that talk about it are Matthew and Luke, and then they give their own very separate versions of the narrative. So there are 4 books that should have it. Only 2 mention it, and those 2 that do mention it have very, very different understandings of the same words that they heard their prophet or their Messiah or God the Son speaking according to Christianity. According to Matthew, the prayer was taught in the course of what has come to be known within Christianity and even through to today as the Sermon on the Mount. Since the sermon was supposed to have been given up on a hill, as Matthew chapter 5 verse 11 says, there must have been a great multitude of people either on the hill or downhill listening to what he said. But when we look at the book according to Luke, or we look at Luke's gospel, this prayer was not taught as part of this particular sermon, which was given down the hill on level ground according to Luke chapter 6 verse 17. So in Matthew chapter 5, verse 11, it's the Sermon on the Mount, up on the mountain. In Luke chapter 6, verse 17, when they talk about exactly the same story, it's down the hill on level ground. So one of them has got it wrong. But Luke records it much later than the Sermon on the Mount. He has it much later. In Luke chapter 11, verse 1 says, "And a certain place Jesus was at prayer. When he ceased, one of the disciples said to him, 'Lord, teach us how to pray, as John taught his disciples.' And he answered, 'When you pray, say.'" But in Luke chapter 11, verse 1 to 2, this is where this course takes place. Nowhere near the Sermon on the Mount or anything like that. So the Lord's Prayer must have been memorized by Jesus' disciples and later followers of him a long time after Jesus in his own original words and language. I mean, it's highly unlikely that the people wouldn't have wanted to speak exactly the same words he spoke, to feel closeness to him. I'll give you an example of this. Imagine, for example, you went to China or India or Russia or any country where they don't speak English, somewhere where English is not spoken widely by the masses. If you had to ask them, sing a song, a secular song, a well-known song, a song that one of the celebrities is singing, one of the well-known singers is singing, will they take that song and translate it into their own language, or will they sing it in English? No. Even they don't even understand English, they will sing it in the language that is English, because that's the way the song was written. Well, let's take a break, and when we get back from the break, we'll continue, inshallah.
While